Thank you, Bill.
It was good that you were there.
Good morning, everybody.
No more
Now
videos,
here is
not this evening,
a
I'm going to do videos, but not at the moment.
three-word version of my talk, and it is, there is hope. In fact, it's quite amazing, isn't it? 75 years after D-Day, here I am, another German speaking to an mainly American audience. I find that quite amazing. So what I'm going to do here is present the basics of the Galileo report. Now, the Galileo report is a commissioned work commissioned by the Scientific and Medical Network. I have a few leaflets out there where you can order the full copy. You can also download it at this website for free as a PDF or order books on print on demand, and I have a very few short versions here. And what I'm going to do here is give you an overview about what this whole enterprise is about. The idea was to pull together arguments and evidence that points to the limitations of the current worldview that is imminent in scientific enterprises, as Larry has pointed out, and I'm going to show you the outline of the argument here. Now, the outline of the argument starts with a very basic insight, that there is no such thing as a scientific enterprise without preconditions and presuppositions. The inescapability of background assumptions, I call it. And this is a general insight that has become prominent since the 1930s, and it shows in ontological assumptions, it shows into methodological, it shows in methodological and epistemological assumptions. And a few of the names that should be mentioned here are here. Collingwood, the philosopher from Oxford, Gödel, who pointed that out in mathematics, Wittgenstein, who pointed it out in philosophy, Fleck, who pointed this out in the generic way how science is done. Collingwood, that is Collingwood here, wrote a very influential book, an essay on metaphysics. And there he pointed out that there is no such thing as an enterprise without assumptions. He called those absolute presuppositions, and these are presuppositions that people make without actually noticing that and without being aware of it. They cannot be proven by the very practice they actually are supposed to found. And they are therefore only open to analytical criticism once you are aware of them. And this is what we have been doing in this report. So I make a distinction into Science 1. That is the current methodology, such as experiments and things like that. Science 2, this is the current background assumptions that people mostly hold unconsciously. And Science 3 would be an enlarged set of background assumptions, and this is what we are driving at. And this would then give rise to what I call Science 1 star, a future widened methodology, which is largely probably enlarged and widened by integrating an inner kind of epistemology, and I will come to that. Now, here are a couple of the most important background assumptions that are operative today. One is, already mentioned, a materialist ontology. Matter is the only reality in the universe, and what you presented, Larry, was a good example of that, right? And out of that, everything else emerges, which also means all seemingly non-material entities like mind, angels, demons, gods, consciousness are non-existent. In epistemology, one of the most important assumptions is that reductive analysis is the only method. Some people say the most important, the only method of choice to understand complicated matters. So if you have something complicated, you break it down into units and then you understand it. And experience, observation and experiment is the only primary way of gaining knowledge. Everything else, like theory, is secondary. Then in methodology, we also have logical analysis of the theoretical structures. They have to use binary logic. And that is a very catchy thing, I think, because it leads us into the either-or trap. The point is logical structures only apply to sentences. Already Aristotle pointed that out. But what is behind the sentences, reality itself, is not obeying a logical either-or structure. And the most important danger I think we have come into through scientific reasoning is that we now treat everything as if it were obeying an either-or logical structure. And that is probably a profound fallacy, I think. So science is actually reducing complexity illicitly. Now, ethics is a difficult thing because science is not in a position to provide values. Even though evolutionary biology might show us how the ethics we arrived at, it cannot found the norms and the basic purposes. The golden rule is a kind of common thing that comes out of religions, but it is not something science provides for. It's actually something, David Lorimer says, we are living off the ethical capital left by the religion that is still around in a mainly materialist background assumption, science or society. Now, I point out to the limitations of the background assumptions, and the most important limitation already mentioned is that consciousness cannot be explained by that. This guy here is Émile du Bois-Reymond, a German physicist, physiologist in Germany. In 1842, he said, we will be able to show that consciousness is just matter and forces working in the organism. A couple of years later, he said, we probably will never be able to explain consciousness, but still, science is there stating we will be able to do that. But actually, it only works by presupposing a conscious subject stating this assumption. That's a very important and profound insight, which most people forget. Only by a conscious subject, like Dennett saying we are all zombies, can he say we are all zombies. So his statement is actually wrong. But most people don't actually realize that. So consciousness can never, ever be fully explained within a materialist framework. My suggestion is consciousness is irreducible. I wouldn't go as far as to say it is primary. It's probably co-primary, but it has, I think we need to see it as irreducible. And a minimal consensus model is probably a complementarist stance. That's what I call it, where consciousness and matter are two complementary aspects of reality. This lady dressed up as a parrot is maybe you can see it. It's actually a lady sitting on this wood thing, and she's dressed up like a parrot. So sometimes it looks like a parrot. If you look carefully, it's actually a lady. So it's a lady parrot, parrot lady. And I use it as an image of complementarity, right? You have two, Larry explained it, you have two things that cannot be together, and you still need them, these irreducible components, you need them to explain a thing. Now, I use empirical data that show that you actually cannot explain consciousness materialistically. One is this interesting book by Rivas and others, who have collected 100 cases, more than 100 cases of near-death experiences from the literature. They are already published, and they are all verified by medical records. You can in all these cases, you see that the heart has stopped beating for at least 5 minutes, so you can assume there is no blood flow to the brain. And you have near-death experiences in the middle of the events, and also veridical non-local perceptions of all kinds of events. It's an interesting book. I recommend reading it if you don't know it. And these are just hardcore empirical cases. You could say, well, this one is wrong, or that one is wrong, or maybe this one is cooked up, but all of them, not very reasonable assumption. William James, in his presidential address to the to the Society of Psychical Research, he used that bundle argument, right? That you take the sticks together in a bundle, you can't break them. You may be able to break singular sticks, but not the whole bundle. And that is the argument I make here. Then there is the empirical database of parapsychology, which has been around for a long time, and last year Etzel Cardenia brought that together in a huge meta-analysis. You're not supposed to read all that, but it is just to show you there is data around, and these are the most important parapsychological meta-analysis on precognition, PK, presentiment, remote viewing, these things, and all of them show significant effects, some with a highly unlikely statistical significance. Some are not so strong, but all of them together, they show an effect, which I find is quite amazing and should be taken into account. Now, science has already seen the limitation of the analytical strategy. What you see here is an image from an interesting publication by Schlage and colleagues. He is actually the head of the Robert Morris Research Lab in Geneva. So the cigarette industry has actually understood that our organism is much more complicated than medical science would have it. This is the network of enzymes that become active when you smoke one cigarette. Quite interesting, isn't it? And biology has actually already seen how complex our organism is, and the reductive strategy doesn't work. So we could attach ourselves to those advanced methodological principles that are already operative in systems biology, for instance, or holistic approaches within medicine, and synthesis to be announced as a complement to analysis. Otherwise, we won't see a whole strategy or a whole element. Now, limitations of empiricism are next. So the inner experience is actually a complement, and you arrive at that very simply if you understand that any experience, whatever it is, even if it is an outer experience of, say, a tree here, is always foremost a subjective experience with an outside referent. That's the only difference to, say, a mystical experience. In a mystical experience, you don't have an outside reference. You only have your own experience. In an outside in a normal experience, you have an outside referent there, but the experience itself is private, always, and cannot be made public except through discourse, except through methodological advances. So if it comes to inner experiences, I would say they're actually similar. They're very similar experience, but the referent is something untouchable, inner. You can't point to something there. You can't say there is God. And it's, of course, very difficult to disentangle the truth from imagination in inner experiences. Was Joan d'Arc saying that St. Catherine and the Archangel Michael told her to take the French king to coronation? Was she imagining that? Did she actually hear St. Michael and St. Catherine? Difficult to tell. We only have the historical record, and that is the 100 Years' War ended, and the British were driven out of France. Lucky for France. So if you look into science, you also have inner experience there, because you always have inner experiences directed towards an inner reference. And if you look into the scientific terminology, you have from Aristotle terms like noesis, thinking, anchinoia or solertia. That's the Latin term, that's the Greek term, meaning sharp-sightedness, the insight that scientists have when they discover some structure. It's actually quite similar to what you have in spiritual experiences, I find. Now, another step is to go away from that either-or thinking. And Ian McGilchrist, who is one of the counselors on the Galileo project as well and has written a foreword to it, he has written a very influential book, The Master and His Emissary, where he points out that the culture we are actually living in and we are educated in is biased towards that either-or logical thinking because it has advanced language, logical structure, logical analysis very much. What we need is regain this left brain, right brain balance. And one way of doing that would be introducing a culture of consciousness. The old Pali term dhyana actually means culture of consciousness. It was translated into meditation by German Indologists of the 18th and 19th century, but it's actually broader. It's a culture of consciousness, meaning integrating contemplation consciousness studies and consciousness practice like meditation into science. So this would limit either or reasoning into those places where it is actually necessary, analyzing sentences, analyzing logical structure, but not reality as a whole. There is a good example how this limitation to either or structures actually is limiting science. For instance, for a long time it was standard teaching, immune system and nervous systems are separate, either or. It's wrong, we know now. But it took a very long time and a very long battle to bridge that gap, right? Had we not thought too much in either or structures, it wouldn't have been a problem to see that the immune system can actually talk to the nervous system and the nervous system can talk to the immune system. Why not? We now know it does, but for a long time it was dogma to separate them. One example of how either or exclusive thinking is actually hampering scientific progress. Now, when it comes to ethics and values, it is very difficult to found them without an inner access to reality, I would say. Or put differently, inner access to reality might actually be a way of ascertaining ethics and morality on empirical grounds and not on the grounds because someone tells you or because a majority of people have said so. So the question is, is political sanctioning sufficient to make citizens and people in general behave morally or ethically? It obviously isn't. Scientific and other misconduct shows that. And in the end, and that is what is happening now, quality assurance or quality assessment becomes a new religion because it is an operative way of trying to assess quality. I don't think it's actually a good idea. Okay, I move on. So here is a rough outline what Science 3 is supposed to look like. We have an enlarged set of background assumptions, and we use the idea of consciousness as complementary to matter. One method would be inner experience, meditation, contemplation, contemplative science as a new method. And that would mean we have inner experience as a valid access route to reality. Theoretical structures, individual purpose in individual lives, ethics and values. That would rehabilitate introspection as a method, as is already being done. My view is that we could use a complementarist dual aspect view of consciousness where consciousness and matter are arising from a deeper unity, but that's open to debate. I think this is a minimum consensus model, and that would actually allow us to understand how we can directly intuit reality and have direct access to reality through practice of meditation and contemplation, which might give us more insight into knowledge structures and deeper structures of reality, and it might reveal that morality has some foundation in the deep structure of reality, as have mathematical structures that are the basis of physics. We have developed a generalized, I'm finished, this is the last one. We have developed a generalized model of entanglement, which I don't have time to go into, but that might be a minimal consensus model also, how we could incorporate non-locality into a rational world model. And that is, of course, open to debate in future discussions. And we were suggesting maybe postgraduate courses in universities, a journal maybe, or something like that. And anybody who wants to sign up to that purpose, the Scientific and Medical Network is very happy for anybody to endorse that. Send them emails. I have a few copies of the short report. Order or download the large report and send endorsements if you like. Thank you very much.
Harold, I had one question. You mentioned the imbalance between the left and right brain.
Yes.
And so I'm guessing the left brain is dominant, so I'm wondering if you think that might likely explain why so many of us are right-handed.
Say that again. So, why so many?
Of us are right-handed.
Good question, maybe. I don't know. I'm not a neurologist, but it may explain
And I ask
that.
with my right hand.
Hi. You talked about consciousness. I look at it as like looking at it as our individual consciousness. And Deepak Chopra and Manas Kapatos talked about the fundamental awareness as a primordial consciousness, which is distinct from our consciousness. So do you have that, like consciousness is complementary to matter?
Yeah.
And do you have that idea of this greater consciousness and maybe layers that they talked about?
Well, you might say that this model would be something like that. This is a term from Jung, and I think there probably are various levels there. I'm talking about individual consciousness here as complementary to material events, but there may be a deeper structure, which is possible. I think what we need at this point is a minimal consensus from which we can move on. And if we pose an idealistic model of reality with mind primary, I think we are running in the same trap and as either this or that. I think we need some combination of these two.
Thank you.
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned the speculation that some of these mystical experiences are subjective experiences which have no corresponding objective and experience and therefore can't be externally observed. What I'm wondering is that in and of itself potentially a limiting belief that in fact there might be a different frame of reference from which what we consider to be subjective today could be observable rather than simply discarding the possibility of it being objectively observable because our current frame of reference doesn't perceive it.
I think this is partly a misunderstanding. What I wanted to say is that the referent of an inner experience is not in the same way a materially extant outside in the world. And so I think it's important to acknowledge this difference because sometimes people simplistically assume it's just similar to mystical experiences or spiritual experiences are just similar to normal observations. They are not, because the referent is something different. I'm not saying the referent is illusory. I'm just saying it's different. And there may be some time where we will be able to find methodologies to carve out what that referent actually is. Now, the point is we have 500 years of history of how we can analyze outer experience of material things, right? And we are still not sure about the material world around us. So how would we be able to find a methodology that is in the same way rigorous as our scientific methodology of the material world is about the inner world? And I think that's just a challenge for the future, but there may be some time when this is actually true, yes.
Where do you think the role of psychoanalysis is in this debate as a 130-year-old scientific, objective understanding and quest into the subjective world?
Quite interesting, yeah. Thank you for that question. It's actually interesting because psychoanalysis is an example how introspective methodology can be put together in a semi-rigorous way, I would say, and yield a science that is still active and is becoming ever more accepted since the times of Freud. And that is a good example that it is actually possible. Incidentally, psychoanalysis was fed by Brentano's impulse of bringing inner experience to the basis of psychology, because the only non-medical lectures Freud heard were of Brentano in Vienna, but that is just incidental.
Quickly.
I wonder if you could comment on bringing inner experience into the scientific method and whether or not inner experience isn't already in the method that's actually being used, and scientists just aren't aware of it, or perhaps reverse engineering some of the things that are happening in the scientific practice.
Very good point. I think you are right there. It's actually already happening all the time, because every scientist that looks through a telescope and reports what he or she is seeing, or looks through a microscope and notes down what he or she is seeing, is actually using inner experience and then transporting it into some other language. So this is actually there. This is what I tried to show here in this example. It's already there, and it needs to be made present. But the point is, we have no methodology for how to phenomenologically accessing inner experience about non-material reference. Even phenomenology, Husserl's phenomenology, which was actually talking about the outer world, is a very difficult thing to do, and it's still not accepted. So, yeah, you're right, and it's maybe even more complicated.
Thank you, Harald.
But there is hope.
Go enjoy a break.